Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves therapy. Specifically, it involves a subtype of what are known as insight therapies. Now, insight therapies were one of the first sorts of therapies to be devised, and it's probably one of the best known, certainly up until fairly recently. The idea behind insight therapy is to help people gain insight into what it is that is bothering them. Help them gain insight into their behavior or their thought patterns, to help them learn why they are doing and thinking and feeling the way that they do. And usually this involves talking. Insight therapy is also known as talk therapy. So the therapist talks to the patient or client or client talks to the therapist, and through this the person finds out what is underlying their problems in the hope that that will allow them to fix the problems. Now, there's all sorts of details to this. I'm not really going to go through all of the various types. They're usually fairly well explained in textbooks. But I do want to talk a little bit about what I like to call insight therapy at a distance. Is it possible to have this kind of talk therapy with the two individuals involved not in the same room or same city or sometimes same time zone or same continent? And there are indeed ways in which this can be done. Ways in which therapy can be done without people in the same room. It's a lot easier than it used to be. Now, this is not a new idea. There have actually been therapy or therapy of a type being done at a distance for a very long time now. What people used to do is they would write letters in, say, to newspapers or magazines, and the advice columnist in the newspaper or the magazine would publish the answer, the question plus the answer. Probably the best known of these media psychologists would be along the lines of Dear Abby or Ann Landers. Now, Dear Abby and Ann Landers were very smart in that they realized somewhat early on that if they couldn't actually find the answer to the person's problem with their own ideas, and neither of them were trained in psychology, that it's best to ask an expert. And that's when media psychology works best. I really don't care if you're talking Ann Landers or Dear Abby, or all the way through now to radio therapist Dr. Joy Brown or Dr. Ruth Westheimer, or TV therapists like Dr. Drew. And the best way for this to be done is not for the media therapist to think that he or she is going to be able to get to the real root of the person's problems in the 5 or 10 minutes or even hour or hour and a half that that individual has to talk with the patient. You are simply not going to be able to fix everything in that short period of time. I mean, it takes therapists quite a while usually to just get to know the person well enough to even consider suggesting something. What media psychologists tend to do best is to give referrals. What Ann Landers and Dear Abby started was that they would give a person someone to call that could help them with the problem, or they talk to an expert, or suggest, look into here, or go these days you can say, well, go to this website, or email this person, that sort of thing. So they're not very good for actual therapy. Dr. Phil only has so much time to be able to yell at people. That is a certain type of therapy. It's cognitive behavioral, and it does work for some things. But he only has so much time to be able to do that before the show is over and pretty much he's done talking. So it's best for things like referrals. The other problem, of course, with media psychologists is that, as I mentioned, they may not have any real training in psychology. And it's one thing to get advice from a friend, and it's another thing to get advice from someone who you might think is actually much better trained than they are. So one of the problems with media psychologists, again, is to make sure that they do have the training, and also realize that not every doctor is a psychologist. Dr. Laura has been giving people advice on their behavior in their lives for many years now, and she has no training whatsoever in psychology and is actually quite proud of it. So don't assume that just because someone calls themselves doctor that they have real training, true training in whatever aspect of doctoring you're wanting to know about. Given that, though, for the most part, the Dr. Drews and the Dr. Phils and the rest of those people probably have more training than your average telephone therapist does. I've always thought that I need to buy the phone number like 1-800-SHRINK-ME or something like that, because this is where a person calls a 900 number and they presumably talk to a therapist. I say presumably because I suspect that 99.9% of the time they are not talking to a therapist. They're probably talking to a refugee from Miss Cleo's psychic hotline. In that when you're talking 900 numbers, people are paying anywhere from 99 cents to $5 a minute to talk to this person. So very often what's going on is not therapy as much as the person on the end of the line is instructed to keep the other person on the line as long as possible to make as much money. So pretty much stay away from those. Save up your money, and if you really cannot do therapy with someone in your immediate area, there's always cyber therapy. This is a growing field because today, with Wi-Fi connections and computers and cell phones that have webcams basically being ubiquitous, it's possible to have a Skype therapy session from pretty much anywhere in the world to pretty much anywhere in the world. And in a lot of ways, it has advantages in some ways over a face-to-face meeting. One of the advantages, for instance, is that you can be a lot more flexible with scheduling these, because neither person has to make a trip to go into town or go to the office or whatever. All the therapist really needs to do is fix up a corner of their place to make it look fairly official and have a good computer. And in fact, that's another reason why it can be inexpensive, because with cyber therapy, a therapist doesn't need an office at all. They don't need an office, or they don't need to pay utilities, they don't need a support staff. All they need, as I said, is a really good computer and some internet connection. In fact, I think some psychologists probably do therapy sessions dressed a bit like newscasters often do, which is they dress up for the parts of themselves that are visible. And the parts that aren't visible are wearing sweatpants or pajamas. Now, this is also an advantage, as I said, in case someone is living in a place where there are no real experts in the particular type of therapy that needs to be done or the subject of the therapy. And you could literally then have a therapy session with someone halfway around the world. Or if a person may live somewhere where there literally are no therapists. A lot of the parts in the West, for instance, there are more cows than people per square mile, easily. And it might be an hour's drive to the closest decent grocery store, much less psychologist. So this can also help with that, because even the most remote places these days have Wi-Fi and have webcams and such available. One of the final considerations for this is that they are extremely, these cyber therapies are extremely confidential. I live in a small town, and I gotta say that it seems like if I sneeze in the morning, by 3 hours later, people are asking me if I have a cold, even if I haven't sneezed again, because everyone's heard. Everybody is in everybody's business. And seeking help for basically this sort of therapy, insight therapy, seeking help for any kind of mental problem. I mean, think of that word, mental problem. I mean, people start thinking everyone's going to think that I'm crazy, or everyone's going to think that I'm going to shoot up the town or whatever. So they may not want other people to know that they're undergoing therapy. And in a small town, it's very hard to hide if you have to drive up to somewhere and get out and go inside. You know, people are going to see that. But with cyber therapy, it can be completely confidential. Not anonymous necessarily, because the therapist is going to know you, but therapists for the most part don't gossip. It's kind of against the rules. The disadvantage of cyber therapy, well, the major disadvantage is it's very different to talk to a camera than it is to talk to a person. And even a video, a TV picture of a person is not the same as having a person in the room. You're kind of, unloading your soul to your computer, which might seem a bit odd. And also the therapist then may not be able to get all of the cues, the body language and all those sort of things that could actually give some information about what's going on. So there are disadvantages to cyber therapy, but I suspect these days that we're going to see more and more of this sort of thing, which will be interesting. It will be interesting to see where the field goes. Also, with the Affordable Care Act, it turns out now that insurers are going to be required to pay for therapy, psychological therapy as well as physical therapy. Before, most insurers did not do that, or they only covered a few sessions a year. And it's possible that the insurance companies will then just say, okay, if you're going to get therapy, it has to be cyber therapy, because it's less expensive and so forth. But it will be interesting to see where this goes in the near future.